everybody, and welcome back to the T.H.O. Movie Reviews podcast, the show where we bring you passionate, honest, and insightful film criticism. I'm your host, Bennett Campbell Ferguson. This is the second half of our podcast about the most essential films of the 2010s, and I am joined via phone by my wonderful colleagues, Mo Shaunette. First of all, Mo, I know you. I know you're about to get some comics in isolation finally. How are you doing aside from that?
I'm doing okay. I have now moved from recording in my bed to recording in my chair. Yeah, it's kind of a big deal.
Progress. You gotta love it. Well, and also
don't have much choice.
And also here we have Maxwell Meyers. Max, how about you? How you doing?
I'm great. I actually put on real people clothes today, which I've been pretty consistent with at this point because it's kind of a policy. I can't wear pajamas more than like one day, like whole day at a time. Like even when I'm sick, I'm like, I'm gonna put on jeans to lay on the couch, but I'm still laying in bed. I'm laying in bed because it's very comfortable. I'm wearing clothes.
Mo was in bed last time. You're in bed this time. It's good. We got the bed ratio staying consistent, I guess, right?
gotta keep it level.
Well, as I said, we're talking about the most essential films of the 2010s, movies of the past decade that were culturally, commercially impactful in any way. And, Mo, let's start with you. What's the first movie you're going to talk about?
So, I'm actually cheating slightly, and I'm talking about two movies. But I feel like...
Gaming the system! No, it's cool. Go ahead.
You have a system now?
No. Continue.
So, it would be disingenuous to talk about the 2010s in cinema and not talk about the other elements of the Disney company, not just in terms of in terms of stuff like buying Marvel, in terms of buying Star Wars and releasing movies for both those huge properties and franchises, but also launching their streaming service and absorbing Fox, and they're becoming so much of a powerhouse. It's unprecedented. Speaking of monopolies, and so there were two, I feel like, that were very instrumental in that, two movies from the Disney company that were very instrumental. The first was Frozen, came out in 2013. Part of the Disney brand is the Disney Princess line, which has somewhat fallen by the wayside since the 90s. Because there's just not as much interest in it for one reason or another. Recent entries like The Princess and the Frog or like Tangled, they made money, but they weren't huge mega hits. And then Frozen comes in and blows the doors down. And I feel like a lot of it was definitely Disney trying to subtly, well, not necessarily subtly, but trying to just slightly change its brand, change its perception, and include a certain level of postmodernism and self-awareness in the stories of them still doing fairy tales, but more with a modern twist to them. And the results they speak for themselves. Frozen made an insane amount of money. It launched this huge franchise. It has a sequel, a theatrically released sequel, which isn't common for Disney animated features. It's just that much of a powerhouse of a movie, a franchise. So yeah, that's one of them that I wanted to talk about. The other major trend of the 2010s in terms of Disney movies is these very safe live-action remakes of their animated classics, and those have been consistently just not really pushing the envelope, just kind of existing, but being extremely profitable in the process. And the first one that really set that trend was Alice in Wonderland in 2010. And you said influential movie, you didn't say good.
That's right, that is correct.
So that one, because on paper it makes sense. It's classic literature for kids, but with kind of a dark undercurrent to it that a lot of people, they think they like to pat themselves on the back that they can pull that to the forefront. You put Tim Burton in charge of that. He's good at that. He's good at making sort of family friendly but still kind of weird and gothic and offbeat stuff. And everyone came out to see it, and it was still riding the crest of Avatar, so it was like, oh, we're not sick of 3D movies anymore, so we'll go see that. It wasn't good, but it made $1 billion. So that was the message. There's money to be made. We can put on these live action remakes of the Disney classics, so we can do new versions of The Jungle Book or of Sleeping Beauty with Maleficent or Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast. And it's sort of a chance for them to kind of tweak them, kind of take a second swing at that, try to make them a little more modern, a little more contemporary, or in the case of Lion King, just do the same thing again with big effects.
Yeah.
And not to very good effect, I would add.
But not live lions.
Yeah.
I still maintain that like the only true live action Lion King would be with real lions. So that was just fancy animation as far as I'm concerned. But continue.
Yeah. But you get my meaning.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I felt like we're an essential part of the 2010s experience.
I was wondering, Mo. I mean, you're right. I mean, Disney has been such a dominant force in Hollywood, for the past decade, and in fact, for the past 5 years, the number one movie of each year was, in fact, a Disney movie. But there's been talk, as this new decade dawns, that they're even though obviously there's no putting the genie back in the bottle, given how well Disney Plus is doing, and given that they still have all these properties, but you have the Star Wars brand being tarnished by Solo and the Rise of Skywalker, and you have the Marvel entering a new age that may be as successful as the last, but there's some uncertainty. And then in terms of live action remakes of animated Disney films, where they're kind of running out of options on that front, because they've done most of the ones that are of note. I mean, what do you think like Disney looks like going forward? I mean, does Frozen point the way to the future, since that's one of the few things they've done in the past 10 years that actually seems like it's something new?
I do think the Disney company is still innovating, because I think we did get interesting new stuff in the 2010s. I still really love Zootopia. I really have a lot of affection for Moana. They have done some interesting stuff. It's just that for all that, for every innovative new thing, they're still coming out with something that feels very safe. So even long-awaited sequels to Pixar movies like Incredibles 2 or Cars 3. So going forward, I feel like that business model might stick around. I do feel like we're going to get a Frozen 3 at some point.
Oh, yeah, no doubt, yeah.
And I really couldn't say. I know there was some behind-the-scenes shake-up recently. I haven't kept 100% track of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Bob Iger, is the guy, who really kind of led Disney as they acquired all these properties and, asserted their dominance to a degree that they hadn't, in the first part of the 21st century. And now he's taking a lesser role, presumably being phased out. And one thing that I thought was kind of interesting is, yeah, well, I mean, he's still kind of involved to some degree, but he's not running the show anymore. And the guy who is now, he is more, he comes from the world of the Disney parks world. So I don't know. I mean, who knows? Maybe he'll be just as successful, but it's a whole new game now, really.
Eddie and I were actually having this conversation. I had this a recent discussion about it because I actually went to Disneyland before, literally, like right as the coronavirus was really starting to pick up world news. It was a scary time to go a little bit, but I hadn't been since I was in middle school, and it was impressive. It's one of the benefits of going down here is being a little closer to them. So, and even Eddie, who was like, "This is going to be a big waste of money. Everything's expensive," and he was like a little kid again. He couldn't believe how much was still there and how much new stuff was there. And I think it's interesting to see when Bob Iger stepped down who he would tap, because I don't think he revolutionized the company, but I think he bolstered it.
Yes.
He did it properly.
He's been a safe choice.
But and that's why, I think, like, compared to his predecessor, Michael Eisner, I think Bob Iger he's a safe choice. He's made him a lot of money, and I think it's very indicative with, going with, Alice in Wonderland, we should remake our own properties, just live action. And I think, and you're right, they've never critically been like, wow, this movie, complete game changer. It's more like, it's fine, and it makes $1 bajillion worldwide, which helps them fund everything else. But I think if there had not been that the backlash and controversy with John Lasseter, I think he would have been the next choice, because John Lasseter spearheaded most of the Disney projects that made money. Like, he was like, let's do a Return to Form, this Princess and the Frog, let's do a Princess story, that's T.H.O, which brought us Tangled, which eventually led to Frozen, and a lot of, figuring out what works and what doesn't. And I think had he not, been embroiled in the Me Too tidal wave that happened, I think he would have been the one in charge. But I think now that we are dealing with this pandemic and the closures of the parks, which only managed to become more profitable as years came on, which was something even Michael Eisner tried to do and kind of stumbled at. I think in this weird moment of, social distancing, I think it's weirdly enough that he's the best choice. And I think it's up this like foresight, like, we're going to need somebody who has a real handle on the theme parks, given people can't see each other. And I think he was a great choice. And I think at the very least, with all the properties at hand and this man of, the new blood in tow, I think it's going to be a very interesting decade for Disney.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about money, but when you don't have to worry about money, what would you produce with that?
I think so too, and I think to address your point, Mo. I mean, I think as you're so right in that the films you mentioned are essential films for the 2010s. I'm sure there's going to be however Disney evolves, there will because of the reality industry, there will be new Disney films in these next 10 years that we're going to deem essential. Max, what's the first movie you want to talk about?
The first one I want to talk about is John Wick. This is I'm sure we all are fully aware of the man. When going through the list, somebody put John Wick on their list, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt like it should be talked about. I think it's a crazy little movie that stars Keanu Reeves, and at the time it came out, we hadn't seen Keanu Reeves in a while. And then this movie came out, pretty much designed to be one film, and it did amazing at the box office. Critically, it was lauded, and in a weird way, and I think what is really great to talk about is actually the stunt work. I think it is mostly what that movie is. But the directors of John Wick, which I'll let my notepad out in the other room.
David Leitch and Chad Stahelski.
Thank you. Former stuntmen who were just like, you know what, let's make our own movie. I think, in our last podcast I talked about, I think what made this decade essential was more of the perspective from which our stories were being told. Less straight cis white men, more queer people, more people of color, more women, and in a weird way, the people on the outside. And more recently, especially in the last 10 years, you've heard more and more cry about, stunt people and their work in the industry. I think you could attribute it to also partially to the Fast and the Furious movies about, each movie's like, oh, we can't just be an action movie. We got to push the envelope. We got to crash a car through a plane on fire.
Or a magnet plane looking at the next movie.
Yeah. And it was just like, oh, we need a tank driving down the highway. But who needs to do that? It's not Vin Diesel. It's Vin Diesel's stunt guy. And in the last years, in the attempt to push the envelope, movies like Resident Evil and I think the new James Bond have had stunt crew members who have died. And there has been a good call in the industry for, safer working conditions for stuntmen, or even a category for stunt performers at the Academy Awards. And I think, the SAG Awards recommend their stunt crew and the stunts in films, and I think there is again, even though they're not, the forefront of the movie, you gotta admit that the movie, like John Wick, don't exist without this incredible stunt performers. And this movie did so well that everybody else was like, how can we get, the stunt crew to help us beef up the action? These people got work after this, and it kind of, revolutionized the game in a weird way. That we got a John Wick 2, a John Wick 3. People are waiting for the John Wick series. This movie kind of came out of nowhere, and it was just a great movie with a great crew of people who worked their ass off, Keanu Reeves included. And now the internet is obsessed with him. We've got this weird late-decade revival of the man, the myth, the legend, Keanu Reeves. And I think, the Keanu fever, which is nothing to do with any of the other symptoms of coronavirus.
Well, I have a confession.
Everyone has Keanu fever, and there is no.
It's a lifelong thing, I think.
But way more exciting.
Well, I got a confession. Until 2 days ago, I had not seen John Wick, but I watched it for this, and I freaking loved it. You're so right, Max. I think to point to the importance of the stunt work, because and I know I'm going to be preaching to the choir since I'm talking to you two. As much as like the action films are a dominant genre, I think there are actually very few filmmakers who look at action as an art. It tends to be just more bombast, more explosions, and then you look at a movie like John Wick, and it may be kind of trite to compare violence to a dance, but it's so the fighting is just so beautifully staged. Like as I was watching, for the first time, the scene where he's going after Alfie Allen in the club with the pool, like I was just I just felt ecstatic, it's just really kind of amazing the precision and elegance and clarity and imagination that went into that film. Like it's a schlock film that really, I think, kind of raises schlock to a pretty high art. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I think, and it has everything to do with the directors. I think this is that thing. It's like putting Greta Gerwig in charge of Little Women. It's better because she's a woman, and it's a movie about women. And in this case, it's, two white guys in a movie about a white guy, but those white guys were also A-class stunt performers, and they're like, how can we push the envelope? How can we make this better? How can we make this so cool? And to get somebody as committed as Keanu Reeves to that vision and idea, it just worked out great. And that movie, once it gets started, you just buckle up and you just go for it. You feel for it. It's not a complicated story. I feel like it has now gotten a little more complex with each movie, but in the idea of John Wick, it's just this pure revenge film / funny, it's drama, it's action, it's all there, and it's beautifully done. It's expertly executed, and it's because, it's not just some director who's just like, I don't know, let's just make a giant explosion. That's action. They're like, no. Action is like the fine-tuned movement in a fight scene. And these guys have helped out movies. Like, this movie did so well, they actually got hired to help out other movies. I think the Marvelous Emancipation of Harley Quinn this year hired on some of the stunt crew that helped do that movie.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yes.
Mo,
it didn't work as well.
Mo, you've reviewed, I think, all of the John Wick films for T.H.O. going back to the first one. Do you have any thoughts on the movie's endurance? What makes it special?
I think it's very committed to this neo-noir style. It's super stylized in everything about it, and that works to its advantage, because there's not a whole lot of other movies like that can blend that with very modern sensibility in terms of action, in terms of choreographed fight scenes that are pulling a lot from Hong Kong martial arts features more than anything else. Mixing that with gunfights, with in the third movie dogfights. The fact that they can kind of spice up the movie by adding in a lot of character actors and recognizable faces into supporting roles. That they're here to have a good time, and they're making something that's really unique and special, and it's definitely influenced the look of action movies going forward. And they're just really fun, engaging movies. They're very straightforward, and there's something refreshing about that.
I agree, absolutely. Well, I got a movie to talk about. The movies you guys just talked about, they're movies that were successful by, I think, any measure in terms of influence, in terms of box office. The movie I'm gonna get into is a little different. It was successful mostly just relative to the kind of movie it was, and that film is The Tree of Life. And when I say relative to the kind of movie it was, I think you got to get in a time machine, metaphorically speaking, and go back to the summer of 2011. It's a pretty big movie summer. We get the last Harry Potter, the first Captain America, X-Men First Class, Thor, and whatnot, and yet somehow the most talked about movie of the summer is a 2-hour plus experimental film about a young boy coming of age in Texas in the 50s, and also the history of the universe, and dinosaurs are involved. And what I think is just so extraordinary about that is, most either indie films or studio indie films are actually, not really that, different than films that, a major studio would make, or could make at least. And I'm not even saying that in a negative way, just, it's just sort of the reality of, how things are. I mean, The Shape of Water is really like an edgier version of, Splash, just as, Napoleon Dynamite and, Juno and Birdman are, all Fox Searchlight movies that are kind of slightly edgier versions of, familiar studio films. And what, like, the sort of the indie world has trouble, like, making succeed in a big way is experimental filmmaking. And the Tree of Life, did that. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary, I think, that, we had a year where the Brad Pitt movie with dinosaurs was a punchline that, that regular people beyond, the usual Terrence Malick dork crowd like myself, understood. And I think I think that's important, and beyond that, I just think it's a really great and beautiful movie, and for Malick, it was kind of the summing up of, you know, his whole career to a certain degree. You know, it represented kind of, you know, his passage from, you know, making period pieces to making contemporary films, because he said it, you know, both in the past and the present, and also, you know, it was his most personal film at the time, because he was you know, he had done all these, you know, films that were, you know, adaptations or about, you know, certain moments in history that he hadn't necessarily experienced, and, you know, that movie is about his childhood. It's very much autobiographical, and yeah, so that's why I think it's essential. You know, I mean, it's a Malick film. You know, it's not, you know, no Malick film like is ever, you know, one of a movie where I would say, like, hey, you know, go watch this, you'll like it no matter what. You know, it's very much an acquired taste, but it's one of those movies where I would say, like, even if it's not your thing, it's so worth watching to kind of you know, see a really unique kind of filmmaking on a grand scale, and to, you know, see a movie that, you know, really against the odds was incredibly impactful when it opened. So yeah, The Tree of Life.
Yeah, I did, but you know what? Like, it's funny you mentioned that, like, everybody knew about the Brad Pitt movie with the dinosaurs. I didn't. I had heard it talked about during awards time, like, as a possibility for nominations, and I don't even remember if it got any Golden Globe nominations.
Well, it was nominated for 3 Oscars: Best Picture, Director, and Cinematography. Although it unjustly, in my opinion, lost cinematography to Hugo, which was a bummer. But, you know, what you gonna do?
Yeah, that's the one it should have won.
Yes, yeah.
And then I remember it being nominated for Best Picture, and I remember when it was announced, I was like, wait, what movie is this? That's what movie people have been talking about? And then the fact that they were like, when they announced it, I remember they announced, they're like, Tree of Life, producers to be determined. I was like, wait, you don't even, if this movie wins, we don't even know who's supposed to collect the Oscar yet? So the fact that I was like, wait, what kind of an answer is that? And when it, of course, just in my pursuit to see all the Best Picture nominees, I remember picking it up on Blu-ray, and I was like, do I need this on Blu-ray? And when I got home, it gave, like, a little, like, thing at the beginning. It was like, for the best experience at home, watching the highest definition, and turn the volume up as loud as possible.
Yeah, which is in front of all I think almost all the Malick DVDs and Blu-rays.
Yeah, and so I was like, what kind of a movie recommends? I was like, what am I getting into? Why does sound play such a big prominent thing? And I think I turned it up a little bit louder, but I think my ex was sleeping or something. But I remember thinking, wow, I really wish I had seen this in theaters. I didn't understand how it played a factor until I was watching it. I was like, man, I'm sad I missed this. I guess my question for you is, like, say 10 years down the line when we're now discussing, you know, the essential films of the 2020s.
Yeah.
What do you think will be its long, like, why do you think we'll go back and, like, because, I mean, Mo still hasn't seen it. I haven't seen it since that day. I know it's one of your favorite movies of all time, but, like, what do you think is the one thing about it that will make people go, oh, yeah, this is a guy we're still talking about the date 10 years from now? That's one of the oldest ones you also mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, you know, I think you know, a couple reasons. I think, you know, part of it is, you know, Terrence Malick is, you know, one of the, you know, most unique filmmakers, I think, who has ever lived, and I think this is his, you know, his most iconic film. You know, I think, you know, perhaps the best representation of, you know, who he is as a filmmaker, what he's interested in, what his style is like. You know, like, there are other, you know, weirder, you know, off the wall films of his that I love, you know, with the most recent, the more recent ones, like Song to Song and Knight of Cups, you know, but those are like, they're kind of obscure curiosities. They don't, you know, they don't kind of represent, like, the scope necessarily, I think, of what he's capable of, and The Tree of Life does. And then beyond that, I think, you know, it was it's just, part of it, I think, is the the breadth of the ambition. I mean, just, you know, at the risk of, you know, kind of belaboring this point, I mean, the sheer guts of, you know, being a writer-director and saying, I'm going to make a film about my childhood within the context of the history of the entire universe. I'm going to position my life and my personal story, you know, alongside the Big Bang and evolution, and try and understand and explain, like, where I fit into not just the world around me, but everything that has ever happened. I mean, the level of what he wanted to do and achieved, I think, is just so kind of, you know, bizarre and staggering and beautiful. I mean, there's an argument to be made, I think, that in some ways it was the most, you know, not necessarily the most ambitious film since 2001, A Space Odyssey, but, you know, the most ambitious film in terms of trying to cover the most ground. And I think, you know, it's, you know, when we look back, you know, I think this is a film we'll be looking back at decades, and, you know, when we look back, you know, which directors were really trying to, you know, push the medium forward, you know, expand the capabilities of what cinema could do. I don't see how, like, any conversation about that could leave out the Tree of Life. I mean,
very well put.
Thank you very much. Let's move on. Mo, what's the next movie you want to talk about?
So the final movie on my list, this is one we've talked about a lot since it came out, because I'm pretty sure we all are absolutely enamored by it, and with good reason, and that movie is Mad Max Fury Road.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Came out in 2015. It's big blockbuster action. It's revival and nostalgia property. Both of those are definitely part of cinema in the 2010s. But for me, what definitely makes it influential, or at the very least essential, is the way it shifts perspective. Because for as much as Mad Max is considered, you know, this bone-crunching, testosterone-fueled, angry, manly man kind of a movie, we get to Fury Road, and it's still a badass, but more than that, it shifts the perspective and makes the hero out of Furiosa, out of the wives, out of out of women, instead of just this one guy. And that explicit feminist narrative in what is a hard R, bone-crunching action movie, that's unexpected and that's different. And I feel like that's definitely, hopefully, that'll have an influence going forward, because you can tell these kinds of big, larger-than-life stories, and not necessarily centered on a cis-het white dude. And that's awesome. And I really love that. I really love this movie, not just because it has a strong feminist message to it, but also just because it's a really well shot, really well made action movie. So yeah, that's my pick for number 4 or technically number 5 is Fury Road.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. This is a movie, you know, that all of us love. I mean, I think this was the only instance in the history of T.H.O. where, you know, we all had the same favorite movie of the year. You know, 2015, we all picked Fury Road, and I think I think you point to something, you know, really important, Mo, in terms of, like, you know, making a feminist movie, like, in that, you know, bone crunching, as you say, you know, hard R world. I mean, it made me think about the fact that, you know, like, our generation, like, I don't think to this point, like, we had, you know, something like along the lines of you know, like T2 or Aliens, where you get to see a woman, lead the charge in that kind of movie, because, certainly we're starting to see more, movies with, women as female superheroes, but then isn't that like kind of like a sort of a different world? Like, it just seems like, like Captain Marvel, is so, for better or worse, like kind of far removed from the kind of like, like grimy world of, Fury Road or Aliens or something like that.
Definitely, yeah. There's definitely precedence for, women being leads in these sort of like grindhouse action movies, but a lot of the time it's them. They're there as sex appeal, as being half naked, hourglass shapes, and that's what they're all about. So then you get to Fury Road, where they're removed from that. They're not objectified. They have agency, and they're the ones moving the plot forward, and Max is just along for the ride. I think that shift in perspective definitely that brings a lot to the table.
I'm glad you picked this movie. When I pulled up the list to see what had been already selected, bummed you already got it, but I'm glad that you got it because it was going to be on my list. I remember telling Eddie, because he hadn't seen it up until a few years ago, and I made him watch it. I would actually argue that out of all the movies we talked about, that is on all of our lists, this was the most successful movie of 2010. It comes out right in the middle, it brings up all the best points, which is it's called Mad Max Fury Road, but it's not entirely about Mad Max. It's more like she's there for the ride, and you're right, they're not objectified. You could argue that they have escaped the bonds of objectification. So it's like, well, what are you going to do in this world? Like, we just want to live, just like anybody else. We're just trying to survive and not be forced to, repopulate this crazy dance world. And it's beautiful. There's no part of it. It feels like it's complete. It feels like there's excess, but the more you analyze it, there is a point to everything, including the bone farmer's giant elephant type. It all has a point and a purpose. Everybody has a backstory. They knew who they are. It's so feminist, and I think you could argue, yeah, we haven't had a movie like Aliens or Terminator 2, but even in then, like Terminator 2 is in service to also the Terminator. She's working together with him.
Sure, absolutely,
I would actually argue Captain Marvel's more like Aliens in the sense that the lead character's female. She's trying to solve the problem, but not that a man could have done the same role, because there's obviously a lot of other things involved. But I mean, you could have changed Ripley with a man and told a very similar story. This one seems to be very placed on like it has to be women, and yeah, I do like that you kind of go in going to think, oh, this is a Mad Max movie, but when you leave, you're like, I mean, it is, but it's more like a day in the life of Mad Max while we watch the story of this group of women unfold as he stumbles into their plot, and just kind of helps out, and it's great. The amount of angry man babies that left that movie is a great example as to why this is essential. It's great to get the secret feminist film that you kind of went in and you're like, oh, damn. And on top of that, you're not mad about it, because you were there rooting the entire time for Furiosa, for Lily, the women that get stolen from, what was the bad guy's name?
Morton Joe.
The Morton Joe. And it's like every element is great. And I think without that movie, you couldn't have John Wick, because the other thing, it's not laden with.
Well, Fury Road came out after John Wick. I mean,
it did.
Yeah, but before Chapter 2 and 3.
Yeah, gotta get them all three. But I think you could argue that it like bolsters the fact that it's like we don't need CGI. What we need are a bunch of people to ride on dune buggies and climb up on the top of a pole that's flying back and forth while one guy plays a guitar that's also a flamethrower. Like, there is, like, you can argue, like, this is actually way cooler than something that's been thrown together with the computer because it's built by people. And it's a great film, and it should have won the Academy Award.
Oh, I agree. Absolutely.
I think it, and it does. It's an entire story about the others, and, you know, while you have this one man in power of everything, and everybody who fights to tear it down, so the wealth can actually be divided. It's a story about a lot of things, and I think I told you, I went through, I think it was the AV Film Geeks. They talked about the 100 greatest films of the 2010s, and we managed to pick the 5 films in the top 5, including this one, Get Out, and Moonlight. Those are like the top 3.
You,
yeah. So I think this was their number 1. Also, I think I would argue it's the most potential film of 2010.
Well, you guys both make I think great points. And before we move on, one thing I just want to mention is like I thought back actually to a conversation we had about the movie around the time it came out. I think that I think that Mo, you and I had seen it, and I think Max, this was right before you had seen it, and we were talking about the Vulini, the group of older women, who give shelter to the heroes at near the end of the film, and then become their allies as they battle their way back to the Citadel. And like I remember, like you posed the question, Max, like, well, how would it be different if instead of a group of older women, they had kind of like had come across a gang of like old motorcycle dudes, and it was like it was a really interesting question, and it made me think about kind of one thing that's so like satisfying about this movie is it's not just a feminist film, it's a very matriarchy focused film.
Yeah.
And that you have as much as the male villains and the kind of male sort of narrator / observer Max, or a presence in the film, you have all these great scenes of women of all these different generations talking to each other and helping each other and arguing with each other as well. It's a really, I think, kind of extraordinary thing. And I think I think when you look back at this decade, this was a movie that was the full package. It was entertaining, it was profound, it was beautiful, it was horrifying, it was exciting. I saw that movie many times in theaters, and without fail, almost any time an audience sees Furiosa kill Immortan Joe, cheers go up. How many movies can you say that? Not many. I mean, most movies where good and evil duke it out, you don't really care because it doesn't feel like that much is at stake, and in this movie it did, which is, I think, a big part of why it was so powerful.
Yes. I think you're right. It's not just about women. I think it is about the patriarchy. You have the women all have a very subservient role, and then including, if you remember, the only other women we see in the film outside of the ninja harem and the movie is right at the beginning, it's the women who are like tasked for making the milk. They're just constantly being pumped, and it's the mother's milk that everyone's drinking all the time. And by the end of the movie, you have the movie literally passing down the seeds to reseed the earth.
Yes.
From the older generation to the younger generation, she literally hands her like life in a bag.
Yes, absolutely.
And then when they do pull in, you wonder, like they just killed the leader, how is this going to react? And then the women who were being pumped for milk are the ones that pull the trigger to release the water that he's held on to for so long, creating the waterfall that literally gives life to the people. it is everything, and it's all very. I think it's so accessible, and that's what made it so great, and why I love my favorite comic that was ever produced for this was it's two women in a car. They're like, yeah, here's this Mad Max movie is really great. And then it says after Mad Max, it's like them. They're like hanging out of the car. They're like, what are you doing? I think that is it's beautiful, great story, and I love that. So.
Well, I have a feeling we're going to continue a discussion in somewhat a similar vein. Max, tell us about your final pick of the podcast.
My final pick was Wonder Woman, and you're right, it does segue nicely.
from the many mothers to Themyscira, right?
Exactly. I think I got to mention, I don't know if it was on the podcast, was that I got a chance to rewatch some of my picks before this, and I'm glad I wanted to sit an extra day with it and think about it. But I think Wonder Woman is definitely one of the essential films of the 2010s. Sure, we all are aware Wonder Woman is a character from DC Comics, but I think this movie was important not because of. I would say that the movie is not perfect, like Mad Max. I wouldn't even say it's perfect in its feminist series, but I will say that what was important about this movie was the timing of it, and a little bit of its history, was the amount of time that we the entertainment industry has tried to resurrect Wonder Woman. The amount of, I think it's these two failed TV shows, one that actually had a pilot that never made it to series, and another movie on many occasions, but also it was now a conversation when this movie came out was, can a woman lead a superhero film? Which sounds ridiculous. It's like, why should that ever be a question? People, and in this movie, I remember telling people, I was like, go see this movie. If you want a female-led superhero film, go see this movie. If you want movies with a female lead, go see this movie. I remember there being this weird, unfair balance of this movie has to be viewed by people. Not because so we can get more DC movies, because also it needed to succeed for so many reasons. If you wanted female-led films, female-led action films, if you wanted more DC films, like the movies leading up to this one were Superman, which not great.
Man of Steel.
Superman.
Oh, Man of Steel.
Man of Steel. Batman v Superman, which introduced Wonder Woman and did not leave people excited for the next movie. And Justice League, and they all...
one was Suicide Squad.
Oh, God.
Dark times, guys.
I mean, this should show you, there were people who were ready to discount this film, not because there was a woman leading it, but just because DC was not doing great. And this movie was good. It was just good. Diana herself is good. She is a good human being who just believes in doing the right thing. It was so good. I forgot how good it was. And it was great because, it's a big, strong group of badass women living on an island that produced this one woman who saves everyone. And I remember I just was like, oh, I hope this is good. And I remember seeing this with a group of friends, and a few of them were women, and one of them, she just started crying. Right as the movie began, she was like, I teared up so many times, she goes, because I never thought I'd get to see a woman kick ass like this and just take charge and be the best part of this movie. And I think a lot of it has to do with Gal Gadot is the best choice for this. She did a great job. I think there's a lot of movies where sometimes you go see it and you're like, I like the main character, but man, that side character was really hilarious. And this is the thing. No one outshines the Wonder Woman in this movie. She is the best part of this film, and I think that speaks a lot to, again, the feminist tones of the decade, or women taking charge. This movie needed to succeed, and we needed to support it, and so many people support supported it, and it made bank. And Patty Jenkins did a great job directing this, and she could have had a lot of her things tied behind her hands tied behind her back. She, a lot of, Wonder Woman was in another movie before this, they got to design the costume. They had to reverse engineer all the designs of the mascara based on the designs created by someone else. So all the shield, the armor was based around this other thing that they didn't even get to fully conceptualize themselves. And it made me really sad to see, after rewatching it, it made me sad to see the Wonder Woman 1984 get, 1984 or 1985?
84, yeah.
Okay, good. I was like, wait, am I mixing up references again? Get pushed back. I'm really sad about that, but I think one could argue I think we still would have gotten a Captain Marvel film whether or not Wonder Woman had done well, but I think you could argue that we might have had to wait a little longer for a Black Widow movie if Wonder Woman had done as well.
Mo, what? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, because I think leading up to this film, a lot of people had been asking for a Black Widow movie, and they're like, yeah, maybe, one day, possibly. And Captain Marvel is such an integral part to the Marvel Universe, I think we would have gotten it regardless. But I think the success of Wonder Woman does play a large hand to even us going, you know what? I think the world is ready for a lot of female action film and superhero film.
I think so too. Yeah. Mo, I mean, you're familiar with Wonder Woman lore. You liked the film. Have you revisited it since 2017? And do you still hold it in high esteem?
So I haven't watched it in a while. I think I watched it on TV one summer, like 2018 or something. But I still have a lot of appreciation for that movie because I know there's so many ways it could have gone wrong. But it's something that has to. It is worth thinking about what the state of superhero movies with female leads was up to this point, because we were like the main ones where you had Supergirl in like the 1970s at some point.
Right.
You had Elektra, you had Catwoman, you had these movies that were these hastily thought out spin-offs to male-led superhero movies. None of them are considered classics or even good. I don't know how much money any of them made, but I can't imagine it's a lot. And so the conventional wisdom was superhero movies with female leads don't sell. And in fact, Ike Perlmutter, who was head of Marvel Studios at the time, he was adamantly against any diverse leads, to the point where Kevin Feige had to step up to Disney and say, hey, if you don't give us more, if you don't give me more creative control instead of this guy, I'm going to step out. And they did, and that's how we get stuff like Black Panther and Captain Marvel. But with Wonder Woman, it very much felt like a lot of it was up in the air, because it's something. Wonder Woman is definitely a character who, over 70 years of being in comics, people have gotten wrong, because there's this ongoing attempt to reconcile the weirdness of the early William Moulton Marston books with the explicit feminist themes, and sort of kind of trying to fix those or melt those into a modern sensibility, or it often feels like, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's just there was a time where Wonder Woman lost her powers and just became like a 70s era spy, and it was like, that's not a good. No, we don't. That's not the story you want to tell. And it very much feels like, because she's the archetypical female superhero, a lot of writers will project what they think that should be onto it, and it definitely feels like a lot of them get that wrong. And so I personally at least was worried that they were going to screw it up. And luckily those fears were alleviated by Patty Jenkins, by Alan Heinberg and Jeff Johns writing the script, by Gal Gadot starring. They got the character. They got what made her such an enduring icon. It's not just that she is one of the few female superheroes who is an A-lister, who leads the pack, who is not a distaff counterpart, but that she's defined by her compassion, by her love, by her ability to kick a tank over or take machine gun fire, but also her absolute adoration for humanity and for man's world, and her belief that despite all of our flaws, all of our setbacks, that we're worth fighting for, and that optimism and that hope, that core to her character. And I'm so overjoyed that they were able to incorporate that into the movie. So yeah, I have a lot of feelings about comic book movies in general, and comic book movies with leads like this in specifics. So I am so happy that this movie came out and was as good as it was. It's not perfect. It's not the best of its genre, but it gets the character right in the way that matters. And that's great.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I think, I think it was interesting, like how you brought up, Mo, like kind of, Supergirl and Catwoman and Elektra and these kind of hastily, produced, movies with, super heroines, and all of those three films were directed by men, incidentally. You look at Wonder Woman, and we keep bringing up Patty Jenkins, and I think rightly so, because I think, one of the things that all comic book films, that succeed have in common is a director who doesn't just want to make a good film, but really believes in what the character stands for. And I think Patty Jenkins, loving Wonder Woman since she was a little kid, and really believing in that kind of against all odds optimism, I think is really is really a big part of why it's so successful. And it was kind of amazing, as you talked about, Max, the kind of the cobwebs of the DC Extended Universe films, before that, and those films, honestly, they were just kind of they were kind of mush, like they felt very like drab and convoluted, and just they were not well written. They were not emotional or exciting or entertaining. And then I think one thing that was really cool that Jenkins did was she kind of blew all those cobwebs away and said, like, hey, let's tell like a really kind of classic, gleaming story that gets back to basics. A hero is called to adventure and undergoes these trials and emerges sadder and wiser maybe, but also stronger. And I think that's a really incredible journey. And we were talking about action earlier in this podcast, and I mean, that No Man's Land scene, of course, became one of the iconic action scenes of the decade. And I'm with you guys. I mean, I think this is a great film. I think it holds up 3 years later, and I can't wait to see the new one whenever the heck it opens, because I think I mean, you look at directors like Sam Raimi and Christopher Nolan, who had a similar passion for a superhero and were able to kind of test the character further and deepen them in a sequel. I don't see any reason why Patty Jenkins can't do that in the new film, because I don't know, I think it will be especially exciting too to see Gal Gadot up against Pedro Pascal and Kristen Wiig, because I don't know, that just seems like it's going to be an interesting hero-villains dynamic.
Yeah, I think Oh, no, you don't know.
So there's two things that I just wanted to note real quickly. The first was just the fact that for the movie release schedule got scrambled, as it has been, we were on track to have 4 big-budget, tentpole superhero movies come out that were directed by and starring women. Because we had Birds of Prey, Wonder Woman 1984, Black Widow, and then The Eternals.
Mm-hmm.
And the success of Wonder Woman definitely speaks to that there's a market for this viewpoint in this genre, and that people that Marvel and DC have both leaned into that, and they've embraced it. The other thing is that really makes me look forward to Wonder Woman 1984 is that the original one was not intentionally, but sort of in the age of Trump, that it's this definitively female-centered, female-led movie became such a triumph, such a rally cry. We look forward to 1984, where the villain is, by all appearances, is this business mogul who represents the obnoxious, wretched excess of 1980s capitalism with terrible hair.
Sounds familiar.
I'm looking forward to seeing Wonder Woman fight that.
I think you're right. I think at the beginning of my point, I did bring up I was like, it's not fair, but Wonder Woman needs to succeed. We need to show that it is marketable. And that is the one thing people came out to see this movie. And I think it did show that, okay, this is a thing we can trust. And I think when people love Suicide Squad, they said, well, that wasn't great, but I kind of like Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn. And I recently did, earlier this year, one of the few movies I didn't have to see before it was the Harley Quinn movie. And I remember thinking, that wasn't great. But you know what? I did take from it. Margot Robbie loves Harley Quinn. She loves being Harley Quinn. I found out she was a dork in her youth, and I think she really loves being Harley Quinn and just understands her to a certain extent. And I was like, you know what? I am actually very excited. It did make me excited for the next Suicide Squad, only for the fact that James Gunn is in control, which I trust him. I feel like he is ready to play with a group of people, which he is on record shown he can do well with. But I think now, unlike Guardians of the Galaxy, where he's like, I have these characters, I'm going to interpret them this way, I think he's now working with a cast of characters he can interpret one way, with Margot Robbie going, you know what, I feel like I really understand this character, I've lived with this character for a few years, and I think he's going into this with a loaded weapon in a complete way. I think it's only going to work to his advantage, and so even though I was not pleased as, satisfied with the Harley Quinn movie as I said I would be with the Wonder Woman films, I'm excited to see that people are willing to put trust in women like Margot Robbie or Patty Jenkins or Gal Gadot to interpret these characters how they see it and bring something to it. And I think that is the long-lasting impression Wonder Woman has given, which is that that women should have more of a hand in female-centric films, or all films, really.
Absolutely. I'm into that.
I don't think Margot Robbie's going to be in the next Suicide Squad movie.
Oh, no, she is, yeah.
She is.
Oh. Yeah. Well, I love Birds of Prey, so I'm just really hoping we get a sequel to that one.
I would still go see a Birds of Prey sequel. I didn't think it was so flawed, I wouldn't see it again. I would see a sequel. I loved it. And she's mostly the reason.
I wanna. This is a tangent, but Lauren Wynn, who's a sort of a pop culture pundit who I follow on Twitter, she did a big epic Twitter thread where she was analyzing all these details in Birds of Prey or Harley Quinn or whatever we're supposed to call it now. But
I'm taking with Birds of Prey.
It sounds good. And Kathy Yan, who directed Birds of Prey, responded to it. So I don't know. That was the most exciting thing to me about the whole Birds of Prey phenomenon. That the director, not only put a lot of heart into the film, but also, cared to, reach out to a fan. And I'm excited to see what she does next, because I know she's doing a movie for A24. So I'm sure her career is going to be really interesting. You guys ready for my final pick, which will be our final of the podcast?
Go out.
All right. Well, this is a movie that comes from another great, inspiring filmmaker, and it's Alfonso Cuarón's Roma, which, as I mentioned before, I feel a little bad, stealing all the Cuarón films from Max, but but it's just.
As long as it gets talked about.
Yes, yeah. Why did I pick Roma? Beyond it, being a great movie. I was thinking a lot about, how it was influential and what it meant when it came out and was so successful. And I realized that it had an impact on a lot of different levels. And I think the first one is, this decade did not have a lot of, sort of historical epics where you get to see an ordinary person, how their life, intersects with a major historical event. And so, kind of telling the story of how Yelitsa Aparicio's character, how her life is affected by the Corpus Christi massacre, and within, all these kind of amazing, widescreen shots that, really give you a feel for Mexico City at that moment. It was really, I think, like kind of the pinnacle of a sort of historical epic filmmaking of this age. And the second reason why I think it remains essential and was really important is that Netflix was already kind of sort of encroaching on traditional Hollywood by this point. They had released Okja and a number of other films, but Roma won 3 Oscars, including Best Director. It was incredibly popular. This was the movie which said that, if you care about movies, if you consider yourself a movie fan, you can really no longer ignore Netflix, because, once, they're working with Cuarón, you can't say anymore that, Netflix is just this other thing because they're a streaming giant. They're not really in the club. This movie really kind of made it official that they were a major player in that world, and laid the groundwork for, The Irishman and Marriage Story, and now, David Fincher is making his next film at Netflix, and, a lot of other major filmmakers I'm sure will too. And finally, I want to talk about the most important reason why I think Roma remains essential, and that's that, it's, I believe, the only, film that reached a mainstream audience that, dramatizes the lives of working class indigenous women in Mexico. And the movie really did a lot, in terms of calling attention to that experience. And funny story, just before we started recording, I was on Facebook, and a PBS video came up with a recent interview with Yelitsa Aparicio, talking about how she's in addition to being an actress, she's also become a major advocate for women like the character she plays in the film. So I just think like one thing that always really bothered me is that even though Roma was an incredibly successful, incredibly well loved, one of the downsides of it being really widely seen is that a lot of people, I think, were quick to like either damn it with faint praise, or say like oh it's boring, it's not, why does anyone like this, blah blah blah. And I just find that so, infuriating and insensitive. And, like, what I say is, like, you know, not everyone has to like Roma, but I feel like everyone has to acknowledge that, you know, Roma is important to cinema, it's important to the world, it's important to Mexico. You know, not many films, I think, you know, that you know, come out can say that they really matter and really have an effect on the world. And, you know, this is a movie that was, you know, partly responsible for domestic workers, you know, in Mexico getting, you know, better benefits, you know, including retirement. And I just think, you know, it's a really great film. You know, it's another one you have to see it to kind of get a sense of where cinema was going in this past decade. And what do you know? It just a couple months ago came out in a beautiful Criterion edition. It looks great. It's still powerful, and that's why I think, you know, it's not just great. It's essential.
Here. Oh,
I agree.
I love Roma. I think it's another thing though. It's also it's a story about class as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And
yeah.
I think that's like Parasite winning Best Picture. You know, it's a movie about Mexico City, but you know, at the time it came out, it felt very much about, again, a story about one thing that really relates to a lot of things we may have experienced or are experiencing or have gone through, which was, you know, you're kind of witnessing, you know, an immigrant's tale within a city. And I remember, I think it was Ben, you asked, you know, why this has succeeded so well in America, and I was like, I think it's because it just kind of puts the, you know, class and, you know, people who work for us as immigrants that come into our country in a context that is separate from ourselves. It's not about, you know, someone from Mexico coming to America and American dealing with Mexicans. It was just, you know, it's within its own thing outside of us. And I think, you know, in a way, it worked only to its advantage and helped. I think that is why it was so widely recognized by the Academy Awards. They were able to take themselves out of it and just recognize it for the story for what it actually was, and it didn't have to do with us. And I think that is powerful in itself, to see a movie that doesn't deal with the system, much like Parasite. Like, it's not about Americans, but to see it so critically lauded in America, I think it speaks to the story that's being told within it.
Yeah, and I think too, like, you know, like even if, like, you don't, you know, relate to the experiences being depicted, I mean that's part of the magic of cinema, you know, the ability to kind of, you know, put you inside, if you know, the mind of a character really different from yourself, and, you know, feel what they feel. And this, you know, this movie does that, I think, in a really amazing way. And, you know, like, also it was kind of that way for Alfonso Cuaron, you know. I mean, he wasn't, you know, even though presumably one of the little kids in the film is kind of a version of him, you know. I mean, he wasn't necessarily making a movie about his personal experience, you know, aside from depicting kind of the sights and sounds he grew up around. You know, he was, you know, kind of trying to show the life of the woman who for all intents and purposes raised him, and, you know, kind of you know, showing something that he had observed. And I think, you know, that's what great directors do. You know, they acknowledge their experience and they use it, but they also, like, look beyond it as well. And I think that's another thing that's really kind of beautiful about it. All right.
Definitely.
You guys got any?
I don't have a lot to say on this one. I haven't seen it since it first came out. It was not particularly my jam. That having been said, I get why it was so loved. I think it was masterfully shot, really well acted. I think it's a really interesting story, and it's really well told. And yeah, I agree. And there's something to be said about Netflix stepping up and becoming this distributor. That's not just that they have more or less asserted themselves into telling not just, you know, they're not just another TV channel, but they can tell these really in-depth, really worthwhile dramas. And Roma definitely contributed a lot to just bringing attention to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of interesting to think, like you look back again to Okja. I mean, Okja, I don't think played on any, big screens in the, Portland metropolitan area. And then fast forward, to 2018, the Hollywood is showing Roma. Fast forward to last year, you can see The Irishman on the big screen, at Cinema 21, where I work, we had Marriage Story. I mean, the game has changed, and the theatrical window is getting blurrier, and that's only, gonna, I think, be more the case, due to the current pandemic, because, now, people are turning to, streaming, in an even bigger way. I think I saw the other day that, Disney Plus subscriptions went up, so it, like, and, of course, we now have all these movies that were in theaters just a few weeks ago going to VOD. It's, I mean, there's no doubt that, like, that the whole apparatus has changed in a sense, and I don't have a problem with that as long as we have, choices, like that's kind of like my feeling is, like, as long as I can see movies like Roma, like, on a big screen somewhere, like, I can live with them being on Netflix simultaneously, and it's not like, the apocalypse of cinema or anything.
Yeah. I mean, the standards for, or the prerequisites for being nominated for an Academy Award does stipulate that you open in a theater for, like, X amount of theaters for X amount of time. Well, X amount of why. But now that we're kind of at this point, I mean, Trolls 2, not that it was ever going to be nominated for an Academy Award.
And the Oscar goes to Trolls World Tour.
Despite having a theatrical release and then going entirely with an online release. So in theory, you're going to pay $20, you get to see the movie, and in your own home. But, given the state that we're in, I think we are, I mean, and now that Netflix has asserted that, like, we're not just a TV, like you said, not just a TV service, but, a studio that creates things, whether that's movies or binge-worthy TV shows. And I'm wondering how many more, based on just us being trapped inside of our house, this year's nominees that we see at, say, the Golden Globes or the Academy Awards will come from Hulu, Amazon, and Netflix. And also, do you think they will rework the guidelines necessary for nominations to fit maybe this weird new structure that we're in, which is maybe you don't need to open in a theater to be considered? Because, I mean, at this point, there are plenty of movies. The movie theaters just aren't open. Hopefully we get this all under control and social distancing does its job and we flatten the curve and things can, reopen and go back to normal, whenever that is. But, worst case scenario, what if that doesn't happen? Flash forward to, December where, the deadline is. Are we going to see Sonic the Hedgehog going up against Birds of Prey?
I think
is that our selections and Bad Boys for life?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think there are a couple answers. I mean, I think, like as you say, worst case scenario, yes, I think, the guidelines would have to change. After that, I think, we would be going into, much more uncharted territory, because as we all know, a lot of movies, in production are shutting down now. So, if things continue to be really bad for, say, a year or more, movies, on a big scale at least, just won't be made. I think, in the more, like, optimistic, appraisal of the whole thing, I think there's a world in which, like, things are, if not back to normal, I mean, something vaguely resembling normal by the fall, in which case, we would still have the Venice Film Festival, we would still have the Toronto International Film Festival, we could still, if if things get better by the fall, we could still potentially have an awards season, since a lot of the contenders wouldn't be slated for later in the year anyway. But I mean, it's so hard to predict. I mean, like I certainly never predicted that we'd be in the situation we're in now. So I mean,
true. Yeah.
All right. Any final thoughts before we wrap up, you guys?
No, I think I've said my piece.
All right, Mo.
Go see some movies. Take good care of yourself.
Well said.
Stay in, stay safe, stay healthy.
Hear, 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 hear. Well, all that jazz. Well, if you like this podcast, please click thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at T.H.O Movie Reviews. And please check out all the great reviews and content we have at thomoviereviews.wordpress.com. Once again, I'm your host, Bennett Campbell Ferguson, and from all of us here at T.H.O, all those wonderful things Max and Mo just said about staying healthy.